let me say it a different way. In the Judaisms of the first century, in their mind, they gained their covenant membership at birth. They were born into covenant membership because a Jewish man and a Jewish woman gave birth to a Jewish child. So that child was born into covenant membership. Covenant status was conferred to him at birth, right? He was just simply born a covenant member. And therefore, as he grew, he then began to realize his responsibility to maintain his covenant membership and his responsibility to the covenant and the community by keeping Torah, steering clear of idolatry, being faithful to God, bringing the sacrifices when he sinned, following through with all of the positives and the negatives and things like that. So that's the general idea of covenantal nomism and works of the law. All right, I go on to say, if we understand that quite likely, Shaul's socio-religious use of the term circumcision in Galatians 5:2 is actually shorthand for, quote, the man-made ritual that sought to turn Gentiles into Jews before they could be counted as covenant members, then the letter begins to make more sense Hebraically and contextually. So are you understanding now? Let me just read maybe, let's see how much of this I want to read. I think you're starting to get the idea of what we're up against in this particular part of our commentary. Yeah, so maybe one or two more phrases here that I want to read, sentences. Works of the law, as I say in my commentary, is a religious slogan in Paul's day, appears to have focused primarily on the way Torah and Jewish identity serve to distinctively separate and elevate Jewish nationalism above all other social expressions of what was deemed righteous in God's eyes. And that we have a quote from the late Jimmy Dunn, James D.G. Dunn, on the New Perspective on Paul that I'm going to skip over real quick in my study. And I think maybe I can read this part, and then we'll jump into the rest of the commentary. By focusing on a test case verse in Galatians 2:16 in my commentary, we were able to ascertain that in essence, when Paul has Gentile inclusion into Israel in mind, works of the law referred to those sometimes locally autonomous group requirements that were being imposed on non-Jews, as outlined and delegated by each individual group functioning under the prevailing Judaisms of Paul's day. Recall that the Qumran community has unique works of the law that necessarily differed from some other Jewish communities' works of the law, etc. So when he uses the phrase works of law, he's talking about whatever group policy was relevant to the Galatian Gentiles and the proximity of whatever or interaction with whatever Jewish group that they were in contact with in that area. That doesn't necessarily mean that Paul understood that the works of the law in Galatia and that region were identical to the works of law in, say, Israel or other parts of Israel Jewish communities. So it's kind of the same thing in church circles today. Wherever you go, depending on what church you visit or whatnot, or whatever part of the world you visit, you're going to find differing versions of church policy, where they have their membership policy, their bylaws that govern who they are and help to identify what different denomination is in view here. So, in fact, those bylaws and beliefs actually govern and the definitions of the denominations today, right? And we've got thousands of different denominations. Thus, you can understand that's how I'm using the phrase works of the law. Differing group policies, but they had some things in common, and let's read about their commonalities kind of across the board in Judaism. When it came to works of law for Jews, right, this is kind of speaking broadly of the Judaisms of the first century, we discovered that Paul most likely had obedience to Torah done for the sake of keeping Jews separate from Gentile sinners, and ostensibly for maintaining one's righteous place in the covenant people in mind. So as far as the equality of both people groups in Messiah is concerned, Paul, missionary to the Gentiles, had to defend the correct Torah viewpoint in his letters addressed to the churches at Galatia, specifically chapter 5, as well as to the one in Ephesus. So that's what we're working with when we're talking about these particular topics. Circumcision was therefore directly related to works of the law in that it was a shorthand way for Paul to talk about, quote, conversion to Judaism / being or becoming a Jew / maintaining covenant membership via Torah observance. All right. And again, notice what's primarily different about my understanding of the legalism in the first century. The church today likes to believe that the Jewish legalism of the first century was a simplistic do the Torah equals salvation. Keep the Torah equals salvation. Kind of an obedience to the commandments. Works of the law meant keeping the commandments. And if a person, whether he's Jewish or Gentile, didn't matter. If a person kept the commandments long enough and perfectly, then they would be counted as saved. That's kind of the perspective that you're going to encounter if you listen to your average sermon from a pastor, or read your average Bible bookstore commentary to the book of Galatians or something like that. They're going to describe the legalism of the first century as a wooden, what we would today term as a works righteousness or merit theology. However, I disagree with that perspective. I mean, it is true that you can't keep the Torah to be saved. I agree with the theology behind that teaching and behind those sermons, but I disagree with the historical accuracy of the way the Judaisms were leveraging Torah observance and for what purpose they were hoping to achieve by keeping the Torah.